So, welcome everyone to Art in Conversation seminar. Today we will talk about music and how we cognitively and emotionally engage with it. Our two speakers will give the talks, and after that we'll have a discussion, so everyone will have a chance to ask a question or comment. Our first speaker is Dr. Julia Merrill, systematic musicologist at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. Her research interests involve music and speech cognition and emotion, song and speech perception, and voice aesthetics. Dr. Merrill has several projects which investigate how people perceive music. She studies the difference between perceived and felt emotions in music, and she also studies disliked music. For her research, Dr. Merrill investigated psychophysiological reactions to music. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Dr. Merrill. We look forward for your talk. You're welcome to share your screen whenever you're ready. Fantastic, thank you.
Good. So on the slide, you see the leading question for today's seminar. And I would like to approach answering this question by touching on various studies on music perception today. It is important to me that I do not only show results, but to also reflect on the limitations of these studies and the approaches, and what is missing and what future perspectives might be. I see that my camera is off. Is that correct? But it's okay. I cannot. I'll just keep going. So I would like to, yeah?
Yeah, I don't think that your camera is on.
Yeah, it happened when I started.
Yes, this is what happens on Teams. So yeah, we can only see your presentation, but
is that okay?
Yeah, that is okay. Yeah.
Okay, then I'll go back into it. So we're back on, I guess.
The full screen.
Okay, so I would like to start out here with a neurocognitive model of music processing by Stefan Kölsch. There's also others out there, for example, by Isabel Perez. So what you see here are the processes involved in music perception and where in the brain these processes might be located. So the model is based on fMRI and EEG studies that inform about the location as well as the time course of these processes. So what you see here is in the first step, a feature extraction, which happens very early in the brain, in the auditory brainstem. And then the signal goes further, and there's more feature extraction than in the primary auditory cortex. After this, the signal is processed further. There's a gestalt formation processing going on, and also an analysis of intervals. So when you listen to a melody, two tones are put in relation to each other, or also within a chord. And this also happens in areas of the temporal lobe. Structure building processes also take place, and they then go in frontal areas. And to give you an idea what kind of stimuli that have been used for these kind of studies, it is usually sequences of chords, and one of the chords in the sequence doesn't fit the process. So that is when they see the activation in frontal areas, for example. What you see here is basically the central nervous system and what it does to music or these events in music. But the model also includes how the whole body actually reacts to music. So there's vitalization processes going on. The autonomic nervous system is involved, the hormonal system, and also the immune system. And when you listen to music, there are certain action induction tendencies that you have. So you might start nodding your head or actually singing along. Interacting with all these steps is the processing of music, of meaning in music. And this is the cognitive aspect of music perception, if you want to call it like that. And here on the bottom, also interacting with all steps, is emotion processing. So you can now assume that all these processes here are happening or always involved when we listen to music. But what has to be noted, though, is that the studies underlying this model investigated music listening on a small scale. So most studies have looked at short sequences of tones and melodies or chords, and they study event-related processes. For example, an unexpected chord, an unexpected tone in a sequence. So I would like to have a look then into the neural correlates of music emotions. Here you see results from a meta-analysis of functional neuroimaging studies. And what is interesting here is that certain areas pop up that we see in other studies too. This is in figure A here, the amygdala, and in B, the caudate nucleus and the nucleus accumbens. So the question is, of course, why are they here? Why are they involved? So what does it mean? And before I go into that, I would like to give you an example of what kind of studies are actually included in this meta-analysis here. So this is one study where a participant listened to music in the scanner, and they listened to fearful and joyful music. And when the authors compared the two stimuli, then they see that that when with joyful compared to fearful music, they have a stronger activation in the temporal lobes and the amygdala. That you can see that here in that box, the amygdala. And for the other way around, so fearful over joyful, they see activation in blue-white-ish here in the primary sensory cortex. What we need to know is that, of course, fearful music also engages the primary auditory cortex, and it also engages other structures, for example, as the here amygdala. It is just that in the direct comparison, this joyful music here activates these areas more strongly. And this is interesting because the amygdala is engaged here in the positive valenced stimuli. And this is now something that other studies have picked up. For example, this one here by Solimpor and colleagues, that is a very interesting setup they chose here. So participants also listened to music in the scanner, and then they were asked how much money they would be willing to pay in order for the music to be played again, that they can listen to it again. And the bar graph here shows you that with the more money they're willing to spend, these areas here on the left are activated. And these included, and I just showed you those before, it's the nucleus accumbens and the caudate nucleus. And they now see that these areas are part of our reward system. So these areas are also engaged when you eat or when you do sports. And this study, therefore, does not just look at emotions. This is about liking, or most importantly, it's about wanting. So we want this. And that is interesting because this partly answers the question why people actually listen to music. So there's something that we want, we need it. So in another study from the same authors here, they also show that these rewarding aspects here of music, they go together with an increase in physiological arousal. So let me explain to you what they did here. This is also a very interesting setup. So they asked participants to please bring in their favorite music that is able to evoke chills in them. And then they did a matching procedure so that everybody listened to the musical pieces from the others and did a liking rating. And then here in this final setup, they then listened to their own like pieces plus 3 of the others that they considered neutral. And then they measured psychophysiology. That is, for example, skin conductance. That is the production of the sweat glands here of your hands. And you see the straight line and the dotted line. And the straight line shows you the response to the excerpts that are considered pleasurable. And the others here, the dotted line, are the excerpts that are considered neutral. And you see that for skin conductance, heart rate, and respiration rate, these signals go up. So they increase with the degree of reward that they experience about this music. And you see that some other measures here, blood volume, pulse, or temperature, that they actually go down. So what is interesting about this to me, these are arousal measures. So they look like the peripheral system, how it reacts, and it indicates arousal. And here they asked participants to please bring in liked music. But these measures should not differentiate by themselves if where the high arousal comes from, because you also experience high arousal when you are angry, for example. And then these measures should also go up. And because they do not have any other valence indicators, I was wondering if there are studies out there that actually do this comparison of, for example, liked and disliked music. I could not find that much. What I found was this here. This is a study that is not published yet. You can find it at the Claim Center at New York University, here by Ripolis and colleagues. And they had participants also listen to music in the scanner and asked them about how much they liked it or disliked it. And then now here in red and blue, you see a network comprised of regions previously shown to respond to emotional valence. And that was modulated by the highly liked and the disliked musical pieces. So they do not show you a comparison of this is more strongly involved when you like it or dislike it, like we've seen for the fearful and joyful music. Here it is a network that is engaged when we make these judgments, these decisions about liking and disliking. So this is a different approach to investigating aesthetic judgments in music. And also, of course, it is a different approach than characterizing emotions. So what we just saw in the other studies before. And it is interesting to me because I showed you this example of joyful and fearful music. I question a little bit that there is such thing as fearful music. Maybe you can just say that the expression is fearful, but does it really make you scared or feel fear at that moment just by the music? I mean, if it's in combination with the movie that you're watching, that's a different story. But just by the music, feel scared, I would question that. And I'm not the only one who questions this. There's discussions out there about utilitarian and aesthetic emotions and how they might differ. And this is now another part of my talk I would like to go into. These are aesthetic emotions. And I would like to show you this example here from a colleague of mine at MPI, Ines Schindler. And she researches aesthetic emotions in response to artworks in general, so also visual art, not just music. And here you see 4 factors, and in black you see the items that feed these factors. And there's one factor up on top in the middle about beauty and pleasingness. There's also a factor on being moved. And when you look closely, you see that this factor also includes negative emotions, such as makes me sad. In captivation, you see something similar. You can find something suspenseful or even overwhelming. And then, of course, you have negative evaluations when you experience art or listen to music. And then I started thinking, looking back at all the studies that I've shown you before, so which factor here should engage the reward system? We'd say, okay, it's beauty and pleasingness. But with the others, yeah, I mean, you can also search for sad music and you want to feel sad at that moment. Might be, but we don't know. We don't know yet how this relates to each other. And I would say that negative evaluations are also part of the aesthetic experience, and they should be investigated too. So what I now want to show you are 2 studies that we have conducted at MPI, where we tried to look further into the combination of psychophysiological measures and aesthetic emotions. You see here on the right the measures that I've already shown you from Salimpour, how they measured arousal. What we also did on the left is we measured facial EMG, so the muscles and how they're activated in the face. And you see 2 dots here where the eyebrows are. These are the frowning muscles. Then we have right next to the nose wrinkling muscle, so to say, and on the cheeks, the smiling muscle. And we measured these because we thought maybe they would indicate the valence. So if you like it, for example. And the first study I want to show you now is very much related to the study from Salimpour, but we did not ask participants to bring in their liked music. We asked them to bring in, please, their disliked music. We did the same matching procedure. Everybody listened to the pieces by the others. And then during measuring his psychophysiological measures, we had them listen to their 3 disliked pieces and 3 pieces they had a sort of indifferent stance to. And here you see the results. First, the arousal measures. The green boxes show you which were significant. So we have a significant effect in heart rate. And you can see that heart rate increases when you listen to the disliked music. And skin conductance, which is indicated here as phasic activity, also increases with disliked music. We do not have an effect here for respiration rate. So we see what I expected. Like Salem-Poor saw this for the liked music, that arousal goes up. We see it likewise for the disliked music. So it's not just the arousal. We also had the facial EMG measured here. And first you see the corrugator muscle. This is the frowning muscle. And here we do not have a significant effect between the 2 conditions. So this is usually something you do, or we see in studies with basic emotions, that the corrugator muscle is activated when you're angry, for example. So we do not see this. In the middle box, you see the levator labii, that's the nose wrinkling muscle. And here we do have a significant effect. This is more involved when you listen to your disliked music. And this muscle was also seen in other studies indicating disgust. And then in the right box, the zygomaticus activity, that is now the smiling muscle. This is also higher for the disliked music. So people smile more, if you want to interpret like that, for the disliked music than the indifferent music. And of course, we need to talk about what does that mean. But before I do, I want to show you our other study, which shows similar results. So one of our goals at MPI, where I work, is to get more results from ecologically valid situations like this here. So people here listen to a classical concert, which we performed 3 times, and a string quintet played live music. And you see here that people have these white boxes on their back, and with these we measured psychophysiology. Additionally, we asked participants after each movement to indicate their music-evoked emotions. So this was really a full concert with like 2 hours and an intermission. And I want to show you the results, and I need to walk you through these plots. So we read them from the bottom to the top. We start with a little green arrow is on the left with heart rate, and it starts with a string quintet by Ludwig van Beethoven. After that, we have 4 movements of a suite from Brett Dean, who is a contemporary composer, and then after an intermission, a string quintet from Johannes Brahms. And the first thing we see is that heart rate decreases over the course of the concert. So we can interpret this like that the concert had an overall relaxing and calming effect. Of course, it went together with the overall relaxation that we experience in the evenings. You see that the heart rate increases again towards the end, so with the last 2 movements of the Brahms piece. And we also see this increasing, same increase in skin conductance here in the middle of the plot. And this is interesting. This might be due to the composition of that piece by Johannes Brahms. Maybe people were just looking forward that the concert would end pretty soon. These are all things we cannot say at the moment because we did not vary the structure of the concert. We did not mix the pieces. This is something we need to do in the future, and then also ask, of course, participants about their experience. So, but here in this box, what you see for skin conductance and EMG, so this is also the smiling muscle activity here, we see that some movements of the Dean lead to higher activity of skin conductance and the smiling muscle. And this, again, is very interesting because the participants did not like that contemporary piece as much as they liked the others. But still, we have there a higher activity for the zygomaticus muscle. And when we now directly compare the physiology with the aesthetic emotions that we covered after each movement, then we see here in the middle and the right plot for skin conductance and EMG that they increase with the negative emotions that were here tense, uneasy, agitated, and aggressive. We also have a positive correlation here for heart rate and the positive emotions. So heart rate increases with positive emotions, but the others don't. The others increase with the negative emotions. There are other studies out there, for example, one that I mentioned down here, where they compared dissonant with consonant music. And they saw that the dissonant music also engages the smiling muscle more, and they interpret it as a grimacing or ironic laughter. And maybe this is how we can also understand our smiling activity here during the contemporary piece. So what is interesting now, if I want to wrap this up? So we see an increase in arousal measures here, such as skin conductance and the zygomaticus, the smiling muscle. But they can here not only indicate pleasure and liking, but also dislikes and displeasure. And for the future, in order to interpret these physiological responses, we always need the participants' evaluations. Maybe at some point we will be able to have a certain combination of some of these measures that will then tell us what the participant was actually experiencing. I would like to end my talk with a framework for the aesthetic experience, which you find here in the middle. It is indicated with AE. And all the studies that I have presented tried in various ways to capture the aesthetic experience. And this is, of course, still the goal for future research. This framework here shows you what the aesthetic experience is dependent on. So this is for once the music, the sound that is actually listened to. It is the frame, the context, the situation in which the music is actually listened to. And finally, of course, the person who is listening to the music with all the experiences and backgrounds. And also what you see here is how many disciplines we need to include and consider in order to research the aesthetic experience and to find out what it actually is. And that was the end, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your presentation. I would like to, of course, there will be a lot of questions, but for now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is Professor Eric Clarke, who is a Heather Professor of Music at University of Oxford. His main research interests span from the psychology of music, with a particular focus on the psychology of performance, to music theory, musical aesthetics and semiotics, to the application of ecological theory to music perception. He is the author of Ways of Listening, an ecological approach to the perception of musical meaning, and his current projects include a monograph on musical subjectivities and a second edited volume on music and consciousness. Professor Clarke, thank you very much for joining us today, and you can share your screen and please start your presentation.
Thank you. Can I just ask everyone to to mute themselves so we can hear Professor Clarke better? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that.
Great, thanks very much, Nicole. Yes, and I will share my screen now. So and I'll just go back to the beginning. Okay, so thanks very much. And I'm going to try and talk about 3 different areas from my work over the last number of decades. I'm going to start actually not with talking about music perception, but talking about musical performance. So the work that I did when I actually did my own doctorate, and then for some years after that, was concerned with expression in musical performance. And it can be reduced to this question that's in front of you. What makes a performance expressive, and where does that expressivity come from? It's self-evident to anyone who goes to hear live music making that musical performances are expressive, and that the notionally the same piece of music played by different performers can have very different attributes. And a question that I have addressed in my own work is what distinguishes one performance from another, and how might we kind of get an empirical handle on what those performances are like. So here is a figure from a piece of work that I did about 30 years ago now, actually, looking at some performances of a Chopin Prelude by a professional pianist, a pianist who's asked to play this short piece of music. It's just one page of music. It's the Chopin Prelude, Opus 28, number 4 in E minor, a very well-known piece. It's just a single page of music, and he was asked to play this piece a number of times. I actually asked him to play it 3 times, and he chose to play it 6 times because he quite, he enjoyed this process. And what you see here is a figure showing tempo down here, note by note or chord by chord tempo in the first half of the piece. This is just half of the piece, and here is what the piece sounds like. So I'll just stop at that point. Many of you will recognize it. So you can hear that although the notation of the piece doesn't indicate explicitly any tempo variation, that we have this continuous variation. And here you can see it's bar by bar variation that goes on. This is just the tempo taken from the chords in the left hand. And at this point, the profile becomes rather more complex. And up here, actually, we have the dynamics of the left-hand chords as well. I'm going to ignore that for the moment. So the thing that emerges from this is that the expressivity of a performance, which in the case of piano playing can be essentially reduced to variations in tempo, dynamics, articulation, and pedaling, pretty much, that the expression in musical performance is, as I'm sure we would all imagine, not randomly distributed in the performance, but quite systematically distributed in the performance. And here we see that, at least to begin with, the tempo variation is very closely related both to the bar by bar structure of the music, which in turn corresponds to harmonic changes and phrase structures in the music. And then in the second part of this first half of the prelude, the pattern of variation becomes rather more complex and irregular, just as the music itself becomes slightly less predictable, slightly less predictable in its structure. The other thing you can see about this, though, is that these white dots and black dots that are here in the tempo graph are actually 2 separate performances, separated by probably an hour, actually, between them. And you can see that the performer almost exactly replicates many features of his performance. And this is, these are tiny differences of tempo which are exactly replicated. And then at other points, there are quite distinct differences in his performance, corresponding to differences of interpretation. So really what this work was trying to do was to say, what is expression? How can we measure it? And how can we account for the ways in which those expressive features are distributed in a performance? And at that stage in my work, I was very attracted to the idea of explaining most of these differences in terms of musical structure. And perhaps you can see why from this graph. This graph shows something very clear about the structure of the music that's being performed. But since then, my own work has moved on, and a lot of other people have done work in this area, and it's clear that there are other factors at work in musical performance, of course, not only structure, but things to do with emotional expression and actually even historical processes. So I'm going to move on now to a piece of work that I've been doing much more recently with some colleagues here in Oxford, which is actually looking at string orchestra performance, moving away from solo pianists, which offer certain very attractive features in terms of how easy it is to look at that kind of performance, particularly with MIDI-based instruments, trying to do work with expressivity with a large ensemble. This is a 22-piece ensemble of string players, all of them professional string players that we got together for a particular project. And what we were interested in is how do these string players coordinate amongst one another within the ensemble, and with the particular kind of aim being that these string players are playing. They were working on two works, one by Tchaikovsky and one by a rather less well-known composer, Robert Fuchs, who was actually the composition teacher of Gustav Mahler. They were working on two pieces of kind of mid to late 19th century music, and they were trying to adopt performance practice principles from the 19th century, which are, recorded in various kinds of historical documents about how people approached the music of that period, and which we can also hear some traces of even in early 20th century sound recordings from the early part of the 20th century, from 1910 to 1920, show traces of an approach to musical performance that is significantly different from that of a modern orchestra. The approach, for instance, to the kind of looseness or tightness of the coordination amongst players, or even between the left hand and the right hand in the case of a pianist, is different in the 19th century than it is arguably in the later 20th century. So these players are trying to emulate the practices of the 19th century, and we are trying to pick up exactly what every individual player is doing in that ensemble. So these photographs here show how we are using contact microphones attached to people's instruments to pick up exactly what every individual player is doing. So we have 22 channels of sound going into a digital workstation, and from those 22 channels of individual string sound, we can then look at the performance characteristics of the whole ensemble. This actually is the kind of audio trace shown in a particular piece of software for just 6 bars of music, and the 6 violinists reading up and down. These are the 6 violinists that form the first violin section, playing, just as I say, a 6-bar section of the slow movement of the Tchaikovsky string serenade. And you can see what you can see here with these vertical white lines that I'm pointing out with the cursor are the onsets of individual notes in the separate players. And what you can probably see quite clearly in this area here is that the onsets are not perfectly aligned. Now, so for instance, here's the beginning of bar 32, it happens to be. The onset of that bar is here for one player, almost identical for the second player down, but the third player down is quite a bit later. This one is a little bit earlier again, this one is a little bit earlier still, and this one is again later, and so on. And every single note, you can see that there is more or less coincidence between these 6 players. Now, some of this is undoubtedly random error. Although these are professional players, there is undoubtedly a certain amount of random error. But there is also, because we know that this is what the players were trying to do, there is also a degree of deliberate asynchrony going on here. Now, this might seem strange from a modern perspective. We tend to think that what orchestras always try to do is play together. But that is not true. And we know that that is not true by thinking about other musical traditions, such as in jazz, where the kind of looseness of the ensemble actually creates a very characteristic sound. And arguably, that kind of looseness was something that 19th century ensembles were also trying to produce. So here, if we just, as I say, if we expand this a little bit, you can see here how these note onsets, these white lines which represent the note onsets, do not coincide. And this produces a very particular kind of sound to the performance. We can hear a little bit of it. Now, what you don't hear there is a kind of obvious discoordination of the string players. What you hear, if you to hear a larger section and with a better sound system, is a certain kind of timbral quality that comes out of the fact that these players are not playing together. So what we did in this project was both to to take this quantitative data from the audio signal itself, to interview the players extensively about what they were trying to do at various processes in the rehearsal, concert, and actually professional recording that they made out of this project, and to play excerpts of rehearsals, the concert, and the recording to listeners, to ask them to give us some idea about what they heard going on in those performances. And here is just a small snapshot of one of the ways in which we've gone about this. We had quite extensive questionnaires with kind of tick box type responses, but we also gave our listeners the opportunity to use their own words to describe what they heard. And you can hear that in this Tchaikovsky, during one of the early rehearsals, we played them a clip of the sound from one of these early rehearsals, and you can see that the kind of adjectives they're using are things like, messy and sloppy, and that the ensemble is actually not very good and it lacked certain qualities and so on. By the time they get to the concert, some people still hear it as being a kind of muddy sound, but it is also warm and smooth and calm and clear and expressive and those kinds of things. And by the time they get to the recording, which is after 5 days of intensive rehearsal and then 5 days, in fact, of working in the recording studio, the final product is something that they now describe, that independent listeners describe as being warm, expressive, rich, and all of those kinds of qualities. So I use this as an example of one way in which looking at musical performance is both a kind of an investigation into the nature of expressivity, but also how that expressivity is heard and evaluated, if you like, by listeners. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my second topic, which Nicole mentioned already in my book, Ways of Listening, that was published back in 2005, was an attempt to kind of understand the relationship between music perception and musical meaning. So, I mean, this starts from a question which is what we mean by musical meaning, and that difficult question has been approached from a lot of different perspectives. People have seen that there are parallels between music and language, and that perhaps linguistic models might be one way to understand musical meaning. Other people have kind of equated musical meaning with the emotional content of music. Still others have thought about musical meaning from the perspective of kind of gesture and embodiment. And what I wanted to do was to kind of investigate the relationship between music perception and musical meaning. And it's really based on a kind of idea that what if we can hear what something is, then in a sense we have heard what it means. So if I wake up in the middle of the night and hear some dripping sounds outside my bedroom window, I can hear that it's raining. In other words, if I can hear what something is, that this is the sound of dripping, that is hopefully not the sound of a leaking tap or a burst pipe or something, but is a natural kind of dripping, then this tells me, as it were, that it is raining. Well, it seems to me that attitude to our auditory environment, that sort of everyday attitude to sound, is something that also has a great deal of value for thinking about musical sound. In the same sort of way, when I hear some music being played, and if I can hear that is, violins and violas and cellos that are making that sound, so if I can hear what the instruments are, what the source of those sounds is, and what kinds of things they are playing, that they're playing, let's say, classical music, and that I can hear that they're playing it with energetic actions, and that it is part of, the classical style, and that this music is part of the function of concert music and so on, then that is an important sense in which we are hearing the meaning of, where we are hearing musical meanings, and that those musical meanings can be structural meanings, and they can be physical, kind of locational type meanings, they can be meanings of gesture and so on. And there's some very interesting research, what I've called here thin slices of music research, showing that if you play people even very, very short slices of sound, sections of sound from music, as little as half a second to a second, people can actually hear what we think of as being quite high-level properties of the music incredibly quickly. So they will tell you, oh, that's a little burst of opera, even before they can tell you anything about the tonality or the meter or the melody or anything like that. And I think this raises some really interesting questions about the idea, the sort of information processing idea that we start off with low-level properties and we have to build up to high-level properties. What this thin slices of music research suggests is that actually that we have direct access to what we think of as being high-level features, complex features of music. Many of them conveyed through attributes of sound, like timbre, for instance. The timbre of some music may tell us very directly that this is classical music or jazz or rap or, you know, whatever, Indian music. So music perception, as in all perception, can be thought of as a kind of developing attunement to these properties of the environment, an increasing sensitivity to what is out there in our musical and more general perceptual environments, a kind of shaping, if you like. And I rather like using this image to illustrate what I mean by shaping. Here are some trees actually in New Zealand that have been very obviously shaped by the prevailing wind. So they are leaning to the right-hand side in this picture, not because anything, you know, not because they've decided to lean to the right-hand side, but simply because the prevailing wind has meant that they have grown in that direction. And in growing in that direction, they have now actually changed the environment in which they are growing. They now cast shade, for instance, on the ground in a particular place, and that shade may allow new organisms to take root or to live in the shade, and that in turn may help to, I don't know, possibly change the environment, so it may help to fertilize the tree. Let's say some rabbits now can live underneath in the shade of that tree. The droppings of those rabbits will fertilize the ground, and that in turn will help to sustain the tree. So what this shows is that organisms are shaped by their environment, and that shaping in turn changes the environment. So that's a kind of natural living system. If we think about this, not only metaphorically, but in a sense quite literally, as being what it's like to be a human in a culture, we are, in a sense, shaped by the wind of culture, you might say. We develop sensitivities, we grow, almost literally, we grow in a way that is shaped by the prevailing wind or the systematic attributes of our culture, and we become more and more adapted to that culture and in turn influence the nature of the structure, if you like, of that culture itself. Okay, and finally then, moving on to a third area in which I have fairly recently been doing some work, I became very interested in the relationship between music and empathy. So we know from things like the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, the ArCseminar music education programs in the UK, like the choir, and the way in which in lockdown people took to singing together as a form of social bonding. We know that music can be associated with feelings of strong social bonding and kind of mutual understanding and a kind of empathy. And people have proposed various kinds of mechanisms for it. The famous mirror neuron system is one that has been proposed. There have been others who have suggested that the release of certain kinds of neurohormones cause us to feel socially bonded. And the role of synchronization and mimicry in particular has been one that people have focused on. So this raises a question about what kinds of mechanisms there might be, and also whether it is only in the active participation in music, actually making music, that we can feel this kind of social bonding, or whether, if you like, passive exposure to music, just listening to music, can also cause us to feel some kind of social bonding and empathy. So in conjunction with Tia Dinora, the sociologist of music, and Jono Voskoski, who was a postdoc working in Oxford, but who now works in Oslo in the Ritmo Center there, we did some empirical work which asked that question. Can, just by playing music to people, can we change people's empathic attitudes to other cultures? And, you know, there's clearly, if you like, a sort of social and political underlying dimension to this. And if we could induce such a change, would it depend on whether a person was intrinsically more or less an empathic person? So what we did was to ask people to listen to a single 5-minute track of music from if you like, a foreign culture, and then to test using something called the implicit association task, which is a kind of well-established test for people's empathy, to then test whether those people had increased or changed empathy either to the people of the culture from which they had heard the music or to people of an unrelated and also, as it were, foreign culture. And the result that we found was that people who did have an empathic inclination were indeed more affiliated to, more empathic towards people of the same culture as the music that they had heard. So this was, in a way, in some ways, a slightly disappointing result, that it was only those people who were empathically inclined who could be made to feel more empathic towards the people of that culture. But it is an indication that so-called passive listening can potentially quite profoundly affect our sense of our own allegiances to other people's cultures. So I will stop at that point, having used my 20 minutes, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for such an interesting presentation, and thank you both our speakers for their contribution. Now we open up the discussion to all the attendees, but before that, we would like to invite our speakers to comment and respond to each other's presentation. So if there is anything in particular that resonated with you, anything that would be particularly relevant to your point of view, that would be great to hear your thoughts. Julia, would you like to start?
Yes. So I find this point intriguing where you talk about the perception and meaning, and that people then, if they hear what something is, they hear what it means. And that you said that participants or listeners can come up very quickly with an idea of what they hear. So it's opera, it's whatever. You mentioned now musical styles very often. And I try to find out in my research, of course, why people dislike certain music, why they like it, and what other researchers have seen is people come up very quickly with a decision about if they like it or like something or not. And I don't know yet, or nobody knows, what makes this decision at that moment. And one hypothesis is that they use a musical style, which has a certain social meaning around it, or status, and that you say, oh no, this is not what we listen to, and therefore I dislike it, because they characterized it as a style at that moment. I do not quite believe that this is the whole story, but I was wondering if you have looked at these responses depending on liking or the situation where they had to make this judgment. Is there any differentiation you can make?
Yeah, great question. Thanks very much. I very much agree with you that I think it is the way in which people, or one of the factors that causes people to decide so quickly whether they like some music or not, is indeed a kind of very sort of immediate sense of where that music comes from in terms of where it comes from culturally. So if they feel this is the music of a part of culture that I feel, alienated from, then they are likely to dismiss it. There's a rather nice paper that a former colleague of Nicola Dibben published about 10 years ago, called "What Do We Hear When We Hear Music?" And what she did was to give people snatches of music and ask them to say what they heard when they heard that. And one of the respondents, who was played an extract of the Beethoven violin concerto, responded, her immediate response was posh music. So she didn't, she immediately associated this with a kind of music that was not part of her own social class. And I think that speaks volumes about how people, just from the sound that it's an orchestra and a solo violin, can think, oh, that's the kind of music that people listen to, that's not my music. Now, in some ways, again, it's a kind of slightly, it's a kind of depressing picture of that we tend to make these very snap judgments, and that perhaps we'll put off whole areas of music because of making snap judgments about what those associations are. And perhaps one thing that music education, should be doing is trying to make people feel less alienated from music that's from different music, and to try and get them to kind of open that box and allow themselves to hear other things that are going on. And I suppose that speaks to the kind of model of musical meaning that was mentioned, which is what is going on in a piece of music. It's of course a whole lot of different things. There are these social, sort of ideological things that are going on in a sense, but then there are also, amazing things to do with structures and instruments, and virtuosity and empathy and what. And if you can get people to tune into some of those, then they have important results.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask a question in return, as it were?
Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, Julia, and I was struck by, in a sense, how it moved from a focus that was very much on brain areas through to a focus that became increasingly, first of all, concerned with the body through various kind of physiological measures, and at the end, with this kind of quite broad model that had, social and historical and other kinds of context. And I wondered how there have been those people who have been quite critical, in a sense, of the neuroscientific focus, that it is very reductionist and it seems to locate everything in the brain, and at times seem to ignore the fact that there is a body connected to that brain, and let alone the environment that's connected to the body that's then connected to the brain, and so on. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how you see that difficult relationship between a focus on the brain and these other areas.
So yeah, first I have to say, well, I've done fMRI studies myself too. It's a while back, but I've done it, and this is always every method has its restrictions, and so if it's going to be very hard to play full pieces of music to people laying in the scanner. What are you looking for? What are you interested in? You need to know, sort of. You cannot just see what's going on in the brain while they listen to 30 minutes of music listening. That is just not it. There are ways, but it's not usually done that way, and it's very complicated. So this is why I think they focus very much on controlled stimuli with a chord that's different, and that's why I also said it's limited. Yeah, I mean, this is very limited, and I think it is true that these processes that I showed you here, for example, are going on in the brain when we listen to music, but it's a small scale, and we do not know anything about what's happening when we listen to full pieces of music by using this method. We have to use different methods to find out more, or we have to apply these methods better, but I don't know how people would do this. EEG is, for example, much better to do that. So we're restricted there, and so this is why I understand how they do it and how they just focus on little things. And then it's also, I think you said that in your talk too, that this model is very much related to language processing. So they're trying to have this comparison in there too, to see if there's something wrong in the sequence. How do we react to it? And then I think other methods are just more applicable to what we want to find out. And this is, for example, we can do EEG, but also psychophysiology. It's just methods at the moment we can use better to see what is going on while people listen to music than it is, for example, fMRI. So this is, I think, one reason why I would not right now. The things that I'm interested in are very much related to in which situations people listen to music, what kind of music, why do they do that, and fMRI is just not the method to find out more about this. It's you can do other things with that. Does it answer the question in a way?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, and I mean, it's clear from this really nice looking study with the wonderful concert hall that you have in the MPI, that you can there try to start bringing together some of those methods. I suppose I still have some concern, I suppose is the right word, concern about the way in which locating brain areas at times seems like an end in itself, and I'm sometimes left thinking, well, what? Who cares whether it's in the amygdala or the or anyone else? Yeah, as long as some part of the brain is doing it, I don't mind where it is and what it's called. And I suppose it is out of the. I think sometimes it would be good to draw for those people doing that work to draw out the implications of what it means to say it's in the amygdala rather than the nucleus accumbens or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah, but the reward system, I think this is still striking, that this is something that is engaged in other activities too. And so it kind of tells us that music listening can be as important as eating. Yeah. And into the direction of understanding why we listen to music, why this is such an important thing. I would still say that eating comes first, because if you're hungry, music cannot do that for you. But it can do something. And this is an interesting part, I think, that we learned from these studies.
Thank you so much. And I think both Marina and I have following up questions, but I would like to encourage the attendees, if you'd like to ask questions, please raise your hand and we'll invite you to unmute you, or you can type in the question in the chat. Marina, would you like to pose your question first?
Yes, thank you very much. I have questions for both Julia and Eric. So I'll just start with Julia. When you were talking about this psychophysiological arousal you found in people who were listening to music, and you linked this to Ines Schindler's research on aesthetic emotions, in her theory, in the theory which she develops, there is this idea that in art we can experience very intensive emotions, including negative ones, in a safe surroundings. So this is kind of the not the meaning of art, of course, but this explains the specificity of aesthetic emotions. Do you think that this is in part the purpose of music, that we can experience very intensive emotions, with our body, not just with our brain, and be in a safe surrounding?
Yeah, but the question still is it really the same? Is it the same? And this is this discussion about the utilitarian and aesthetic emotion. Can you actually that's what I said, can you actually be scared just from listening to music? Maybe in the brain it mimics this, and that's why we see certain areas that are then activated, that are also activated, but it's still all in the scanner. If you're in the wild and you see a tiger, I'm pretty sure that is different than when you hear the expression in music as being fearful. And this is, I think, the point that I wanted to make. But of course, Ines is right that this can be, we can also modulate or manage our mood. Mood management is always a point here. We can manage our mood with music, and it has an effect on us, of course. And we can use it in music therapy and all these things. And yes, some people want to also experience confusion, and that's why they engage. They want to be cognitively engaged when they experience art. These are all aspects of it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's just that there is several studies which show that engaging with art changes the way we then cognitively engage with reality. That's why I'm asking, if we experience such intensive emotions in music, does it help, for example, us to regulate emotions in the real world? So if I experience so many negative and different emotions in music, can it help me regulate my emotions, which I then one day will experience in real life? So that's what you were saying, I guess, about therapy, music therapy.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't know this, and I cannot really respond to that. I don't know if it helps in that way. Maybe Eric can say something about it, but I don't know.
Thank you very much.
I was going to say, I think that's an interesting thought. I think it raises some quite thorny questions about the function of art, which is, of course, not only to make our lives easier and more comfortable, but almost, in much of 20th and 21st century art, to do almost the opposite, to disturb and unsettle and cause to be questionable our attitudes to the world. And a great deal of contemporary art is deliberately unsettling and disturbing and disorienting. So you could say that the function of art is actually to make our relationship with reality more problematic, deliberately more problematic in if you like, in high art contexts. if you're thinking about art therapy, then clearly it would be a cruel therapist that brought a kind of art or a kind of music that destabilized an already unstable person. And so I think, and in a sense, this is why you find that a lot of the music that is used in music therapy situations is a very containing and a very familiar and a very very orderly kind of music. I'm most familiar, I suppose, with the Nordhoff-Robbins music therapy approach, in which music therapists play, improvise music with their clients. And I've observed quite a bit of Nordhoff-Robbins music therapy over a number of years. And sometimes I've actually felt quite frustrated in a way by the way in which therapists constantly sort of calm and manage and contain their clients. And I have felt at times, but it's not for me to say so, but from the outside, I've sometimes thought, God, if I was that client, I'd want to just kind of smash the instruments, to have something, to do something that was dramatic and that broke out of this containing kind of approach. But of course, I am a relatively, I think, a relatively stable. I don't have mental health problems of an obvious kind. So it's a very different thing to say for someone who does have mental health problems or who is autistic or whatever, that the music that they should be exposed to clearly does have to have some of those attributes to help them to manage their own world.
Great, thank you very much. You mean that we can use music to regulate our emotions? Like sometimes sad people can listen to sad music.
Yeah, I mean, that's widely documented. I think that people, again, Tia Denora's book, Music in Everyday Life, talks a lot about music as what she calls a technology of the self, the way in which people use music as a way of managing their emotions. I mean, not everyone does. I was actually having a discussion with my partner the other day in which she was saying that someone had said to her, what kind of music do you use when you're feeling, when you're feeling down? And she said, I never use music in that way. And I think I'm the same, actually. I happen not to use music in that very sort of mood managing way, not for any kind of terribly purist reasons, and not because I'm a professor of music or anything like that, just because that's not my habit. But I do know, but lots of studies have shown that people use music. For instance, there was a study done by John Sloboda back in the 1990s where he showed that he asked people to say, when do you have music on and what purpose usually do you find, or what is that associated with? And the people who he was asking were mostly university students, and many of them, but the great majority of them said, I put music on when I'm preparing to go out. And what I do is I use that music to kind of up my mood, to make me feel excited about going out, to make me feel, if you like, socially gregarious and socially active. And I mean, that I can remember as a student also probably using music in that way, of feeling kind of excited about going out and putting something on my own sound system that increased that sense of excitement. Yeah.
Can I add something to this? That just this year, a study came out by Amanda Krause on when people do not listen to music. You need to check that out. So.
Great. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I guess while I was hearing you commenting on this, I wondered what is your point of view in terms of like the complexity, perceiving the complexity of music, because of course, as you were saying, Eric, perhaps you, while listening to music, you also bring your expertise, and I wonder what is your point of view in thinking of what is the difference in the perceived complexity of the music when the person listening has a certain expertise or not, and perhaps what is it that makes an expert? Because of course in empirical aesthetics there is also a question, I think, still open to debate, because what makes you an expert? Is it simply formal training, or cultural knowledge? So it's
yeah, I mean, great question. Thank you very much. I mean, there was a period when musicologists and psychologists were quite attracted to the idea of using information theory, for instance, to try and quantify the complexity of musical structures. And there are, you know, a musicologist, an American musicologist called Leonard Meyer, for instance, wrote a number of books which kind of played around with those ideas. And there was a book back in the 60s or 70s by a French man called Abraham Moles, who looked at aesthetics and information theory. And there are some very attractive things about that in some ways. It looks like a quantifiable and a very kind of sort of material kind of approach to it. But I think there are real problems with that, because, and I suppose they're reflected in what I said earlier about how I think about musical meaning, because something that appears to have very simple material properties may specify or be connected with, or if you like, speak to a very complex cultural context and situation, and may be laden with attributes that are not literally present in the material itself. So actually, again, I've been going to some concerts, live concerts again, quite recently, and I heard a piece by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt 2 nights ago, actually. And as people who know Arvo Pärt's music may know, he writes very sparse, apparently very simple, very kind of meditative music. But it is music that is deeply kind of invested with well, I mean, first of all, with his own, with attitudes and philosophical positions and so on that are associated with his own approach to musical composition. And for those people who know that, and they can, as it were, hear in this very simple music all kinds of very complex and perhaps contradictory properties going on. So I think we have to think about the complexity of any aesthetic phenomenon, not just in terms of the measurable complexity of the materials themselves, but in terms of the whole environment. And by that I mean a cultural environment as well as a physical environment, by the whole environment that is specified in those sounds. Those sounds, you know, those simple sounds may specify, to use a kind of ecological term, may specify a whole world that which in the mind of a person who is attuned to that world has a degree of complexity that is out of all proportion to the simplicity of the materials. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, a Picasso cartoon. There is a famous, you know, drawing of Stravinsky actually by Picasso, which is, you know, a few pencil lines on a page, but it tells us about Stravinsky, and you know, and that is already an incredibly strong and rich cultural domain that is specified in those few lines. I think cartoons are a very good example of how the simplicity of an object may be out of all proportion to the complexity of what is being conveyed.
Should I add something to this, or do you want to? Yes. Okay. Yeah. There was just 2 thoughts I had when you asked this question. So with the expert and some of those psychological studies or from neuroscience, they always have the musician and the non-musician. It's always great. Who are those? And so what I started using is by Müllensiefen, the Musical Sophistication Index, for example. And I really like this approach because the participants we have there, if they have formal training or not, they engage differently with music. And it's not just listening time, it's also reading about music, writing about music, just being more interested in that. Yeah. And so I like this approach of musical sophistication with participants, just to give you an idea here. And the other thing with the complexity, I just want to tell you from my own study about disliked music, what we found is that people dislike music if it's too complex, but also if it's too simple. And this is this old dichotomy of simplicity and complexity, or variety and uniformity. So these 2 things. And what I thought was interesting, because we did an interview study and we talked about the disliked music with people, that they have maybe some sort of ideal in their mind. And if it kind of diverges from this to the left or the right with complexity, simplicity, they do not like it anymore. And of course, the contemporary classical music was one example for the too high complexity, just to give you an example of how participants talk about it and use it.
Thank you. Yeah, and absolutely, I agree that. And again, thank you both for your thoughts. It's something to be really aware, both the cultural implications, but also how we measure these cultural implications in the empirical studies. I just wonder if there's anyone that would like to ask a question. I just want to give a bit of space because the conversation is very lively. Otherwise, we'll just keep discussing because I can think of many questions, but I don't want to keep the chair position. I don't want to abuse of the chair position. But yeah, I don't know, Marina, do you have a question?
Yeah, so if nobody wants to ask, then I have many, but I'll just ask some of them. Eric, when you talked about the meaning in music, I was just wondering what do you think about meaning related to abstract concepts which people can associate with music, like metaphors? Because I know that in cinema, music is often used to kind of create metaphorical meaning out of literal one. And just Nicole and I, we recently discussed that in opera, in famous operas like in Tosca, sometimes you listen what the singer sings, but you don't know the words, and you think that it is so cognitively complex what she's singing about. But when you read what she's actually singing, you're just so surprised that actually what she sings is very cognitively simple. It's just, So we were just wondering whether this is investigated. I mean, the metaphors and abstract concepts which people associate with certain music.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, I mean, I certainly don't want to give the impression that that musical meaning is entirely based on our perceptual relationship with it. I think there is something about the immediacy of listening to music in the here and now, whether it's a recording or a live performance, that moment of being involved in music as you listen to it, which is very powerfully kind of connected to what's going on at the moment. But we also, of course, have the capacity to kind of reflect upon and to stand back from and even to daydream about music while the music's going on, or just in our memories and imagination. And in that case, and I think a lot of other factors come into play. Indeed, reflecting upon the kind of cognitive content of what might be happening, either in the words connected with the music. Again, actually, this same concert that I went to with the Arvo Pärt, that they also there was a performance of Schumann's song cycle Dichterliebe. So I mean, a song cycle is a very obvious place where one has, poetry, sometimes by, a wonderful and famous poet with really interesting poems, sometimes with really banal words, actually really stupid words. And you think, my God, this incredible music, but these stupid words, what's that all about? I'd rather not know what the words are quite often. So I think there are complex ways in which what one might call primary consciousness of music, that feeling of being absolutely on the bow wave of music as it happens and unfurls, that primary consciousness of music is fantastically tangled up with what one might call secondary or higher order consciousness of music, that capacity to reflect upon those things and to use language to think about what's happening. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about music is that for some people in some circumstances, music seems to give access to a kind of primary consciousness that in the rest of our lives we find quite difficult to recover. Arguably, an infant who does not yet have language has a kind of immediacy in their relationship to the world, a kind of primary consciousness, which is very hard ever to go back to once we have language. You know, our linguistic minds are constantly on the go. And for some people, music is one place where they come close to kind of letting go of that voice in the head that is constantly trying to interpret things in verbal terms. And, you know, I suppose, you know, people, particularly in kind of clubbing contexts where they are incredibly physically involved in the music, and in music which tends not to have any either doesn't have words at all or doesn't have very interesting words, that sense of being just a kind of body that is being moved by music is a kind of an attempt perhaps to return to that kind of primal state of being in relation to a world.
Thank you very much.
So just to add on that, I just have a quick question, because what you were saying, Eric, can it be interpreted also as communication, as in music as a mean of communicating as an emotional state? Isn't that also communication that is not necessarily mediated by language?
Yeah, but there are some kind of weird questions though about who is communicating, isn't there? Because, you know, if I go to hear, let's say I go to hear Schumann's Dichterliebe, as I did 2 nights ago, sung by a man called Ian Bostridge and played on the piano by a man called Julius Drake. Is it Bostridge and Drake who are communicating to me, or is it Schumann from beyond the grave who is communicating to me, or is it some sort of abstract thing that is neither the two performers nor the composer, but a kind of feeling of the music itself somehow communicating with me? But then, you know, music is not a person. Music doesn't have, in a sense, its own independent agency. So, and this is why I think people often feel that music is communicating something kind of ineffable and ungraspable, because it's hard to know what is the origin of this communication. I absolutely agree with you. It feels like communication, but there are some really weird questions about where the communication is coming from.
Yeah, I agree, and perhaps that also can be extended to visual art, and are very different other types of art that I think that extends to art more in general.
I mean, I agree. For instance, I went to see an exhibition of paintings by Paula Rego recently in London, and you know, you look at these paintings and they're extraordinary. You know, they have an enormous impact. But I didn't feel that Paula Rego was kind of, as it were, speaking to me through those paintings. I felt here are some paintings that communicate something, but it's both. I mean, clearly she has made them, but I'm experiencing something more than just that. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps predictive processing might offer a way of interpreting this kind of feeling of communication in terms of like reducing uncertainty of our predictions about the world. But I am aware that there is a question in the chat. But Marina, can you please read it? Because I'm not sure. I can't see it on my chat.
Yes, it's a question by Sarah Mormon to Julia. So she asks, Julia, I saw on one of your early slides the immune system being affected by music, and I'm wondering if you can point me to some studies on this.
Yeah, so this study I showed you here by Chopin Prelude, she already goes into this with this review. It's a review article, so you will find further literature there. Yeah, it is broadly, it's connected to the well-being. Yeah, if you feel good, if you engage with something positive, or when you sing, for example, you breathe in a lot of air. Yeah. So these kind of things. That's what it shows. But there's also something with hormones connected to that. But I cannot repeat this right now. You need to check it out. I could add something to this discussion from just a second ago, because I also looked into the felt and perceived emotion. And Yeah, what I was always thinking, I mean, it's the listener who perceives something in the music, and some say they now recognize an expression. But where does this come from, this expression? So because we have a composer in the back, so the composer felt something while he or she was composing. Did he or she put that in the music already, expecting that the listener would exactly first perceive it and then also feel it? I mean, there's also a problem here, because there can be a positive expression, or I don't think there could be anything like this is the expression. I mean, it's always your perception. Yeah. So you perceive it to be happy. Does it then make you happy? I mean, lots of music is out there that is very happy, but you just don't like it, and therefore it won't make you happy. So this felt emotion there, it doesn't have to be congruent with the expressed or with the perceived emotion. But this is what I was thinking about in this process. What does the composer put into the music? What do we perceive and what do we feel is a long way also in this direction of how music communicates with us emotionally.
Yes, that's a great that's a great point, and I think that often, especially in psychology and empirical science, we tend to look at the perception of art and the reception of art, but we don't often take into account the point of view of the artist, and most that doesn't necessarily want to communicate something, but wants to open the meaning. And actually Dhanraj Vishwanath offers a very interesting model of art that kind of tries to explain this this aspect. I can see that Dhanraj is here, so I don't know if he wants to comment on that. But yes, it's a great point, and I think it's definitely worth keeping it in mind. I can see that we have only 5 minutes left. I wonder. Oh yeah, please. I can see that Jonathan just raised his hand. So please.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I'm not able to find the chat feature. That's why I was not able to type in the chat. But my question is either for Yulia or Eric, and it's considering we say that music can shape us and shape our emotions and regulate emotions. Is it likely that we could be influenced by music that we don't find empathy with? In other words, to develop a taste towards that eventually, even if we don't initially like such music.
I could quickly have a go at that. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the answer is I'm sure definitely yes. And I think that this is back to what I was saying about kind of shaping and attunement. I think that it's well known that the human brain and the human mind is incredibly malleable. I mean, we also have all kinds of resistances, it has to be recognized, but nonetheless, it is incredibly malleable, and we can acquire new kind of interests and new responsiveness to all kinds of things. So I think a lot of it is about finding openings, if you like, and finding a way to start to have a relationship with something that seems at first sight off-putting. But I think I'm basically extremely culturally optimistic, I suppose, that for instance, I remember vividly the first time I heard Javanese gamelan music in a live context about 30 years ago. And the first half of the concert I found really quite baffling and could make very little sense of it. And even by the second half of the concert, I felt, without any formal instruction or anything like that, I started to feel, yeah, I'm starting to get a hang about what this might be about.
Julia, would you like to add anything to that?
No.
Okay, well, I guess we have. Is there another hand raised?
Jane Pettigrew has got her hand up. Oh, yeah.
Yes, please.
Jane, you're muted.
I missed the earlier part of this talk because I've just come out of teaching all day, and I really do. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And you may have covered this earlier, but I just wondered if you talked or reviewed the theories of David Huron in a book called Sweet Anticipation, Music and the Psychology of Expectation, who does grapple with the intertanglements of brain psychology, rewards mechanisms, and culture, acculturated patterns of expectation. I don't know if that's been discussed, but if the speakers were, what they thought of David Huron's theories on that kind of feedback loop of memory and expectation and understanding response as a combination of both remembered and in the moment phenomena.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, we did touch on reward, but Julia and Eric, would you like to comment?
I'm happy to. Sorry, I don't want to jump in, but I'm happy to, because actually I was asked to review the book when it came out. So, and I remember writing an extremely positive review of it, because I think it is. I mean, David Huron is a very extraordinary and brilliant researcher, and I think it is an amazing book. Actually, there are things about it that I don't agree with, but that's another matter. But I think it is a really fantastic approach to understanding the relationship between expectation and either the thwarting of expectation or the gratifying of expectation, and the ways in which that can inform an understanding of music and emotion, about musical humor, about an understanding of musical structure, about musical. I mean, although it claims to be a book that is only about music and expectation, it's actually almost a whole theory of music, but based around the notion of expectation. So no, I think it's a fantastic book, and as I say, I don't agree with all of it, but I think it makes its case extremely brilliantly. Yeah, yeah.
Julia, would you like to comment anything about this?
Not particularly, no.
Okay, then. Well, we are towards the end of our meeting. Thank you very much for this lively conversation, and for both our speakers to take part of this seminar. Marina, would you like to announce the next one?
Yes, sure. The next seminar will be held next week, next Friday, and it will be about text and image and comics and stuff. So you're all welcome for the next seminar. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you very much again to our speakers.